Welcome to the Playing Books podcast.
Hello, everyone.
I am so excited for what we have on the table today, friends. We are cracking open a text that, I'll be honest, it sounds a little dry on the surface.
It really does.
It's got a one-word title,
Yep.
just 4 letters. It sits there on the shelf looking very serious and academic.
Right, like an accounting manual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But don't let that fool you. This is actually a story about sex, drugs, power, and the very specific, very infuriating reason why your rent is so high.
It is completely deceptive. It sounds like a term you'd hear in a dusty back office, but it's actually the key to understanding the whole economic machine.
Yeah, we are looking at this book, Rent, What is Political Economy, by Joe Collins.
It's a fantastic piece of work.
And let's just set the stakes right now for everyone listening. This isn't just about paying a landlord on the first of the month.
No, not at all.
It's not just about whether you should, sign a lease or try to get a mortgage. This is about the fundamental machinery of capitalism. It is about how wealth is extracted rather than created.
That is the crucial distinction right there. Extraction versus creation.
Right.
My mission today is to kind of act as your guide through the analysis that Joe Collins lays out in the book. We need to understand that rent isn't just a simple transaction. It is a relationship of power.
A relationship of power.
Exactly. It defines who has power and who pays for the privilege of existing in that system.
It really feels like a red pill moment, to borrow a phrase. Once you understand what rent actually is.
The way Collins defines it.
Right, the way the book defines it. You just can't unsee it. You start seeing it in your phone bill. You see it in the price of your coffee. You see it in why billionaires exist.
It's like putting on a pair of glasses that reveals the hidden wiring of the world.
It really is. And that brings us to the challenge for you, the listener. Because we are targeting this podcast at an audience age 18 and older today.
Yes, because this affects your wallet directly.
Directly. And we're getting into some heavy real-world realities. So don't just passively listen to this episode. Let the ideas in this book enhance your life. As we talk today, ask yourself a really hard question. Are you a maker, or are you paying rent to someone who just owns?
It's a very confronting question to ask yourself. Most people assume they are makers just because they have a job.
I mean, I definitely assume that.
Right. But the book challenges that assumption hard.
It really does. So as we go through the stories in this book, I want you to think about where you see rent in your own life, not just your apartment. Look at your phone apps, your student loans, even your own job.
Everything.
So let's jump in. Or actually, let's start with the word itself.
Good place to start.
Because Collins opens the book by digging into where this word rent comes from.
Yeah.
And it is surprisingly violent.
It is. The etymology is fascinating and, yeah, quite dark. We tend to use words without really thinking about their history.
Oh, for sure.
But Collins traces rent back to the 12th century. It likely comes from the French word rent, meaning income, which derives from the Latin render.
Render.
Right. Which means to give back or give up.
To give back. Okay, well, that sounds polite enough, right? Sounds like a normal transaction.
Yeah.
I give you this, you give me that.
It does sound that way until you look at the other linguistic root. To give something back or render, it must first be torn or rent from its possessor.
Oh, yeah.
Think of the phrase heart-rending or rending your garments.
Like tearing clothes and grease.
Exactly. It implies a tearing apart, a violent physical separation.
That is visceral.
Very.
So rent isn't just a polite transaction where I, hand you money for a nice service. Implicit in the very history of the word is a tearing of value from the person who actually created it.
Huh.
It feels aggressive.
It is aggressive. It frames the payment not as an exchange of equals in a free market, but as a surrender.
A surrender.
You are surrendering a portion of what you have produced or earned to someone else. And not because they helped you produce it, but simply because they hold the rights.
They just hold the piece of paper.
Right. And while the definition has evolved over the centuries, that core tension absolutely remains. Collins points out that until the late 19th century, rent almost exclusively meant payment for land.
But today, it's everywhere.
Everywhere.
Well, let's talk about the modern reality of renting before we get into the heavy economic theory, because I think there's this massive misconception that everyone, everywhere, wants to own a home.
The ultimate goal, supposedly.
Right. Like renting is just a temporary failure state until you can finally afford to buy. But Collins brings up some OECD data that actually really surprised me.
It flies in the face of the American dream, or the British dream, doesn't it?
It really does.
The data shows that roughly 1 in 3 people in OECD countries rent.
1 in 3.
Yeah, but the outliers are what's truly fascinating. In Germany, 47% of people rent. And in Switzerland, it's 55%. Renting is actually more common than owning there.
That is wild to me. I mean, Switzerland is one of the wealthiest countries on earth.
Exactly.
So if they are renting, it clearly isn't just about being too poor to buy.
No, it's entirely structural. It's how their economy and housing market are designed.
Okay, so renting isn't inherently a sign of poverty.
Right. But just because it's common doesn't mean it's without its issues. Collins used a really great analogy to explain the sort of innocent side of renting, the Bali scooter analogy.
Oh, I like this one. It's very relatable. Walk us through it.
Okay, imagine you go to Bali or Mykonos for a 2-week holiday.
Sounds great.
Right. You need a scooter to get around the island, but you aren't going to buy a scooter for just 2 weeks.
No, that would be financially ridiculous.
Right. You'd have to buy it, insure it, register it with the local government, and then try to sell it 14 days later when you fly home.
A total nightmare. I just want to go to the beach.
Exactly. So what do? You pay a local shop owner a fee. You pay for the temporary use of their asset.
Makes total sense.
It's efficient. You get the utility of the scooter without the massive burden of ownership.
Right. I pay you, I use the scooter, I give it back.
Yeah.
No tearing, no violence, just basic utility. It feels fair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is what economists call contract rent in its simplest, most benign form. It's what mainstream economists love to point to. They say, look, the market works, needs are met efficiently.
Sure.
But Collins pivots pretty quickly in the book to show that this simple contract actually hides deep power imbalances. Because it's not always a tourist renting a scooter on holiday.
No, it's not.
Sometimes it's a desperate person needing a roof over their head in the dead of winter.
And this is where we get into the dark side of the book. Because when you're a tourist, you can just walk away.
Right?
You don't need this scooter to survive. You could just walk or take a bus.
No.
But housing,
Housing is non-negotiable.
it's totally different. The book discusses the sex for rent scandal. And honestly, I want to be careful here, but reading the statistics from the shelter charity survey that Collins cites, it was chilling. I literally had to put the book down for a second.
It is horrific to read, but we have to look at it objectively because it illustrates the point perfectly. When one party has a monopoly on an absolute necessity for survival, the contract stops being a free choice and becomes outright coercion.
Coercion, yeah.
In 2017, the charity shelter found that 140,000 women in England alone had been propositioned for sex in place of rent.
Just in England.
Just in England. And that was just in the previous year.
140,000 women. I mean, that is a staggering number. That is the size of a small city. We aren't talking about a few bad apples here. We are talking about a massive systemic abuse of power.
And the book highlights that the COVID-19 pandemic just poured gasoline on that fire. When the lockdowns hit, people lost their service industry jobs almost instantly.
Overnight. Just gone.
And suddenly you have thousands upon thousands of people who literally cannot pay.
Right.
The Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women reported a massive spike in sexual harassment complaints from tenants during the pandemic. Landlords knew exactly what was happening. They knew their tenants had nowhere else to go.
Because no one was hiring, and you couldn't even leave your house.
Exactly. When people lose their jobs and face immediate eviction, the power dynamic shifts completely, 100% to the landlord.
That's the key, isn't it? Power. There's this quote Collins uses. Let me see. Yeah, he writes, "The debtor isn't looking at the hand, reaching out to see if it belongs to a financier or a rentier. They are just desperate."
Desperation changes everything.
When you're desperate, the contract isn't a choice anymore. It's just extortion.
Precisely. We are just reporting what's in the text here, but the data clearly shows that this desperation fuels serious social unrest. We saw this during the pandemic. The book details the rent strikes we saw popping up.
Oh, right.
Hashtags like cancel rent and can't pay May.
I remember those trending on Twitter. It felt like a massive global movement for a minute there.
It wasn't just online activism either. There were real-world consequences. Collins mentions the revenge evictions in Hackney, London.
That story was wild.
It really makes you think. A landlord, a company called Simpson House 3 Limited, literally served eviction notices to tenants who simply dared to ask for rent reductions during the peak of the pandemic.
They just asked for help.
They organized as a building. They sent a letter saying, hey, we are struggling. People have lost jobs. Can we negotiate a temporary reduction? And the response was basically, get out.
And there's a billionaire involved in that story too, right?
Yes, John Christodoulou. He's a major property tycoon. What's fascinating from a sociological perspective and deeply ironic is that while his company was serving eviction notices during a global health crisis, he was simultaneously publicly funding charities delivering care packages to the homeless.
Wow. It really highlights the massive disconnect. You can hand out soup with one hand for a photo op and sign eviction notices with the other. It shows that rent isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It is a profound social struggle.
It really is. It's about who gets to stay in the city and who gets pushed out to the margins.
Which is exactly why Collins says we need to look backward
Yeah,
to understand how we actually got here.
we have to.
Because rent hasn't always meant a check you write to a property manager. If we want to understand the modern economy, we have to understand the feudal one.
Absolutely. We have to go way back. In the Middle Ages, you didn't have a market for apartments.
Right.
You didn't browse Zillow to find a two-bedroom. You had the corvée.
The corvée. Okay, this sounds like something straight out of a history textbook, but explain what it actually meant for the average peasant back then. Imagine I'm a peasant in 12th century France. What is my day-to-day life?
Your life is pretty much just labor. You live on land owned by a lord. You have no legal right to leave that land.
No.
None. You are tied to it. You certainly have no right to sell the land. And to pay for the privilege of not being violently kicked off or killed, you owe the lord your labor.
My physical labor.
Yes. It was sometimes called the Barschchina in Eastern Europe. Essentially, you work the lord's land for a certain number of days a week. Maybe 3 days you farm for him, and 3 days you farm for yourself to survive.
So I'm not paying for a service.
Yeah.
I am literally working for free in the mud because the Lord has a divine right to the earth and I don't.
Exactly. That backbreaking labor was the rent.
Wow.
It wasn't hidden behind a direct deposit or a bank transfer. It was you, sweating in a field for someone else, simply because they had the sword and the royal title. It was based entirely on brute force and tradition, not supply and demand.
It's so transparently exploitative when you strip away the modern banking system.
It really is. But what's interesting is that even back then, early thinkers were wrestling with whether this was fair or moral. Collins touches on Islamic economic thought in the book, which provides a really interesting contrast.
Oh, right, Abu Yusuf.
Yes, in the 8th century. He was an Islamic jurist looking at land taxation and rent, and he argued for a proportionate rent, so a percentage share of the crop rather than a fixed fee.
Why? What's the economic difference there?
It's all about incentives. If I, as the landlord, take 20% of your crop, I want you to grow a massive crop.
Right, because your take goes up.
Exactly. I want you to succeed. But if I charge you a flat fee of 10 gold coins, I don't care if your crop fails and your family starves as long as I get my coins.
You just want your flat rate.
Right. Abu Yusuf wanted to align incentives to encourage agricultural production.
That sounds almost like a modern corporate incentive structure.
It's very sophisticated. But then you had another thinker, Ibn Hazm, a bit later on, who was much more radical.
What was his take?
He argued that renting land should be prohibited entirely. He believed that owners should either cultivate the land themselves or they shouldn't own it at all.
That is a radical idea even today. Use it or lose it.
Very radical.
Imagine if we applied that to, like, all those empty investment condos in New York or London, just sitting there, vacant as safety deposit boxes in the sky.
It would completely collapse the global real estate market overnight.
Huh. Yeah, it would. But this tension, this fundamental conflict between those who own and those who work, it really explodes when we get to the physiocrats in the book.
Right.
And I have to say, this is one of my favorite parts of the episode prep because of the historical insults.
The insults are incredible.
Top tier. The sterile class.
It is a absolutely devastating label for an economist to use. The physiocrats were this group of French thinkers in the 18th century, led by people like François Quesnay.
Okay.
They were looking at the French economy, which at the time was an absolute mess of debt and poverty, and they were trying to figure out where wealth actually comes from. Their core belief was simple. Nature is the only true source of value.
Nature. So if you aren't growing something out of the dirt, you aren't making value.
Precisely. They believed that when a farmer plants a single seed, nature magically multiplies it. One seed becomes a stalk with 100 grains of wheat.
Right.
That physical multiplication is value creation. That is real wealth.
Okay, I follow that. Farmers create real stuff.
But everyone else, a merchant who transports and sells the grain, or a tailor who turns wool into a coat. The physiocrats said, no, You are just reshaping or moving what nature already produced. You aren't creating new value from nothing. You are just shuffling it around.
And the landlord, where does he fit in?
The landlord does absolutely nothing.
Right.
They don't plant, they don't sow, they don't transport. They just sit there and collect the surplus wealth the farmer grew. So the physiocrats labeled the landlords the sterile class. Unproductive. Dead weight on society.
I love that. You are sterile. You produce nothing. It really sets the ideological stage for the French Revolution, doesn't it?
Completely.
People started questioning why these powdered aristocrats deserve all the money and food when they do literally nothing but own a piece of paper.
It absolutely laid the intellectual groundwork for overthrowing the aristocracy. It delegitimized their entire existence. If you are a sterile class, why do you get to rule the country?
Right.
But the real drama, the real heavy lifting of modern economic theory, that picks up when the book moves to the classical school in Britain. We're talking Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill.
This is where the battle lines really get drawn in the sand, the capitalists versus the landlords.
Yes.
And I think people today forget that these two groups actually hated each other. Like today, we just lump them all together as the rich or the 1%. But back in the 19th century, this was a bare-knuckle cage match for the soul of the economy.
It was a full-blown class war. On one side, you had the rising capitalists. These were the factory owners, the industrialists building mills in Manchester. This was the new money.
Right.
They wanted to build giant factories, hire thousands of workers, and sell manufactured goods globally. But to do that, they needed cheap food.
Wait, why did the factory owners care about food prices?
Because if bread is cheap, they can pay their factory workers much lower wages, and the workers won't starve to death. Lower wages mean higher profit margins for the factory owner.
That is brutal, but very logical.
It's just math to them. On the other side, you had the old landlords, the old money aristocracy. They owned the massive farming estates, and they wanted high food prices.
Because high prices for wheat mean they can charge higher rent to their tenant farmers.
Exactly. And this massive conflict centered on a specific piece of legislation known as the Corn Laws.
The Corn Laws. I mean, it sounds boring, but people literally rioted and died over this, right?
They did. The Corn Laws were essentially high tariffs that kept cheap foreign grain from entering Britain. Landlords aggressively lobbied the government for them because it kept the price of British grain artificially high.
Right, creating a monopoly.
Right. They argued to the public, oh, we need to protect brave British farmers from foreign competition, but really, they were just protecting their own high rents.
Classic political spin.
Exactly. The capitalists, meanwhile, hated the Corn Laws. They wanted to import massive amounts of cheap grain from America or Eastern Europe so they could feed their factory workers cheaply and keep wages down.
And this is where David Ricardo comes in with a theory that honestly blows my mind a little bit. He says rent is the effect, not the cause, of high prices.
Yes, this is a major turning point in economic thought.
Can you break that down for us? Because I think most people today believe that their local shop owner's rent is high, so the shop owner has to charge more for a cup of coffee just to pay the landlord. Like rent causes the high price.
It is deeply counterintuitive to how we experience the world today. We naturally think, the landlord charges high rent, therefore the farmer has to raise corn prices to survive. Ricardo flipped that entirely,
Okay.
he said. Corn prices are high due to demand, and therefore the landlord raises the rent to capture the profit.
Okay, walk me through that step by step.
Imagine a newly discovered island. It has some amazing, super fertile land near a river, and it has some terrible, rocky, dry land up in the hills. When there are only a few settlers on the island, everyone just farms the great land near the river.
Obviously.
Corn is super cheap because it's incredibly easy to grow, and nobody pays any rent because there's plenty of good land for everyone who wants it.
Okay, sounds like an economic paradise.
It is. But then the population grows over a few generations. All the good land near the river gets claimed. Now, to feed all these new people, the society has to start farming that rocky, bad land up in the hill.
All right, people got to eat.
But it takes twice as much manual labor and time to grow a bushel of corn on the rocks. So the market price of corn across the whole island has to go up just to cover the high cost of farming that bad land.
Okay, so corn becomes expensive because society is forced to utilize inferior, difficult resources.
Exactly. But now, look back down at the guy who still farms the good land near the river.
Okay.
He is now selling his easily grown corn at the new high island-wide price. He is making a massive, massive surplus profit.
And he didn't work any harder. The market demand just moved in his favor.
Right. And here's where the landlord steps in. The landlord looks at that farmer on the good land. sees that massive surplus profit, and says, "I'll take that, thank you very much."
Oh, wow.
That is Ricardo's rent. Rent is simply the financial difference between the most productive land and the least productive land in use. It is a tax on the rest of society's desperate need to use inferior resources to survive.
So the landlord's basically just holding a bucket and catching the overflow of money that's caused by the rest of society struggling.
That is exactly how Ricardo saw it. He mathematically proved, at least to his own satisfaction, that the financial interests of the landlord were directly opposed to the interests of every other class in society.
Wow.
He viewed landlords as parasites who only got rich because the country was struggling to feed a growing population. The richer the landlord got, the harder everyone else had to work just to eat.
That is heavy, calling them parasites. But then, as Collins writes, enters the undisputed heavyweight champion of hating landlords,
Karl Marx.
Karl Marx. He takes Ricardo's ideas and he just radicalizes them.
He does. Marx actually respected Ricardo a lot, but he thought Ricardo didn't go nearly far enough in his critique. Collins quotes this fascinating letter Marx wrote to his collaborator Friedrich Engels.
Yeah, I love this quote. He says, "I have at length got to the bottom of the swindle."
The swindle, it's so revealing.
And I love that he thought of the entire global economy as basically a scam that he had to personally decode, like he was a detective investigating a crime scene.
Well, for Marx, the swindle was entirely grounded in the concept of landed property. It wasn't just about soil fertility, like Ricardo thought.
Right.
It was about the raw legal power to exclude other human beings from the earth. Marx developed this sort of staircase analogy to explain the three different types of rent. And understanding this staircase is crucial to understanding Collins's book.
Okay, let's walk up that staircase. Step 1, differential rent 1.
Right, DR1.
Yeah.
This is basically just Ricardo's original idea. It's about natural fertility and geographical location. Think of the Nile floodplain in Egypt.
Okay, I'm a farmer on the banks of the Nile.
Your land is incredibly fertile because the river naturally floods and deposits rich black silt every year. You grow twice as much wheat with half the effort of a guy farming 10 miles away out in the dry desert.
Okay.
That extra wheat you grew, that isn't because you are a genius farmer or because you worked harder. It's strictly because nature gave your specific plot of land a gift.
Right. Geographic luck.
But in a capitalist property system, you don't get to keep that gift. The landlord calculates exactly how much extra wheat you grew compared to the struggling desert guy, and he takes that exact difference as differential rent 1.
Okay, that makes sense. Nature gave me a gift and the landlord pocketed it.
Exactly.
So that's step 1. Step 2, differential rent 2. This is where the book shows how the trap really closes on people.
Yes, DR2 is about capital investment, human effort. Let's say you and your neighbor have the exact same quality of land, same soil, same weather.
Okay.
But you decide to be smart. You act like a good capitalist maker. You invest your own money and labor to dig a massive irrigation canal to your fields. Your neighbor is lazy and just uses a wooden bucket.
So I'm investing. I'm improving the property. I'm innovating.
You are. And for a while your 10-year lease is active, you make way more profit than your neighbor because your canal waters your crops perfectly. You are winning the capitalist game.
Sounds like the system is working.
But, and here is Marx's trap, what happens when your lease expires?
Oh boy.
The landlord comes down to inspect the property before renewing the lease. He looks around and sees this beautiful new canal. He says, wow, this plot of land is incredibly productive now. It has a state-of-the-art canal.
I see exactly where this is going.
He revalues the land based on its new output. He significantly raises your rent to match the new productivity that you created with your own money and sweat.
That is just brutal. So
Yeah.
I built the canal, I paid for the bricks, I dug the dirt, but the landlord gets all the financial benefit in the long run. He essentially captures my investment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Which completely destroys the long-term incentive for the worker to improve the land.
Right. Why would I build a canal if the landlord is just going to use it as an excuse to hike my rent?
Exactly. This is historically why tenant farmers often lived in absolute squalor. Any visible improvement they made to their homes or farms would just be used against them by the landlord's agent to extract more rent.
It's a built-in mechanism for keeping working people down.
It really is.
Okay, so that brings us to the top of the stairs. Step 3, absolute rent.
Absolute rent. This is the ultimate barrier. Marx argued against Ricardo here. Marx said that even the absolute worst land on Earthland with zero fertility, land that is barely usable, still pays rent.
But wait, Ricardo's whole theory was that the worst land pays zero rent. because it's the baseline.
Right. Ricardo thought rent was just the bonus on good land.
Yeah.
Marx disagreed entirely. He asked a simple question. Why on earth would a private landlord let you use his bad land for free?
Oh,
He wouldn't. He would rather let it sit completely empty and overgrown than let a peasant farm it for zero money.
because he holds the power of exclusion.
Exactly. Private property itself acts as a barrier. You have to pay a toll just across the property line, regardless of the land's quality.
It's just a cover charge for the earth.
Collins uses a very modern, very funny example to illustrate this. The Elon Musk example.
We really can't escape him, can we?
We truly can't. So Collins says, suppose Elon Musk wants to plant baked potatoes.
Make potatoes.
Yes, the book jokes that he genetically crosses marijuana with potatoes.
Only Elon.
Right. So he wants to plant these baked potatoes in Yosemite National Park.
Okay, weird business plan, but let's go with it.
Now, imagine the specific plot of land in Yosemite he wants is agriculturally useless. It's solid granite rock. It has zero natural fertility.
Okay.
According to David Ricardo, the rent for that rock should be strictly zero. But if Musk goes to the owner, which in this case is the federal state, and says, I want to use this rock for a private business, do they say, sure, Elon, go right ahead, it's free?
No. They say pay up.
Exactly. He has to pay a massive lease or rent just to overcome the legal barrier of ownership. The payment has absolutely nothing to do with the fertility of the granite.
Yep.
It has solely to do with the fact that someone else legally owns it and you don't. That is absolute rent. It is literally just the cost of permission.
So Marx is showing us that ownership itself in a capitalist system is fundamentally a tool of extraction.
Yes.
It's not about the landlord contributing anything to the potato farm. It's purely about gatekeeping access to the physical world.
Exactly. But then, as we move through the book, history takes a major turn. We move into the late 19th century, the modern era, and the entire field of economics completely changes how it talks about this.
Right. Collins calls this the mainstream turn.
Yes, this is the neoclassical revolution in economics. The whole focus of the discipline shifts. Economists wanted to be seen as hard scientists.
Like physicists or chemists.
Exactly. They stopped looking at historical classes of people like landlords versus workers, and they started looking at abstract factors of production. They wanted universal laws, formulas, supply and demand curves.
Math.
Lots of math. And in that mathematical process, the very definition of rent completely changed.
It went from being strictly a payment for physical land to something about scarcity.
Correct. It became this abstract concept called economic rent, and the textbook definition is payment in excess of opportunity cost.
Okay, payment in excess of opportunity cost. That is some serious jargon.
It is very dry.
We really need to unpack that because it sounds like a boring accounting rule, but the book uses it to explain so much of our modern celebrity culture.
It really does.
And Collins uses literally the best possible pop culture example here, supermodels.
Yes.
Specifically, the iconic Linda Evangelista quote from the 90s.
It's the perfect illustration of economic rent. Linda Evangelista famously told a reporter, we don't wake up for less than $10,000 a day.
Which, frankly, is an absolute mood. I wish I could say that to my boss.
We all do.
But how does a supermodel's day rate connect to economic rent?
Okay, let's break down that jargon. Opportunity cost is basically the price of your next best option. It's the absolute minimum amount of money needed to convince you to get out of bed and do a specific job.
Okay.
For Linda Evangelista in her prime, the absolute minimum to get her out of bed was $10,000.
Right.
That $10,000 is her economic wage. That covers the physical effort of posing, her time on set, sitting in the makeup chair. If you pay her $10,000, she shows up and works.
Okay, I follow that.
But suppose a major luxury designer, let's say Versace, is putting on a massive show and they are desperate. They don't just want any working model.
They need the face of the decade.
Right. They need Linda. They need her specific, iconic look, her massive global fame. So, to ensure she doesn't go to Chanel instead, Versace offers her $15,000 for the day.
Okay, so she gets an extra $5,000 above her minimum.
That extra $5,000 is economic rent. Oh, I see. It's a payment completely in excess of what was actually needed to make her do the labor. She would have gladly worked for $10,000. The extra $5,000 isn't compensating her for extra hard work or longer hours.
It's compensating her for her scarcity.
Exactly, because you cannot just manufacture another Linda Evangelista in a factory. Her specific genetic look and accumulated fame represent an absolute monopoly. In that specific economic moment, she is essentially acting as the landlord of her own face.
The landlord of her own face. That is such a wild concept.
But it's true, she is extracting rent because she is a highly unique, irreplaceable asset that simply cannot be copied by a competitor.
So under this modern definition, rent is just the premium price you pay for any kind of scarcity.
Yes. Whether that scarcity is natural or artificially created. And this new definition applies to almost everything in the global economy now, not just dirt or supermodels. Take the energy sector. Collins uses a great example contrasting different types of crude oil.
All right, the Nigerian sweet crude versus the Alaskan sour crude. I have to say, sweet and sour oil sounds like something you'd order at a bad Chinese restaurant.
It does sound like a dipping sauce.
Uh-huh.
But in the oil industry, sweet crude is oil that is very easy and cheap to refine. It has low sulfur content. It practically turns itself into gasoline.
Okay, so it's a high-quality product.
Right. Sour crude, on the other hand, is full of nasty impurities. It's thick, it's highly corrosive, and it costs the oil companies an absolute fortune in processing to refine it into usable fuel.
Okay, so clearly one is much better to own than the other.
Exactly. But here is the economic trick that creates the rent. The global market price for a barrel of oil is generally set by the difficult stuff, the sour crude.
Wait, why?
Because the global economy is incredibly thirsty for energy. We need all the oil we can get our hands on to keep the lights on.
Right.
We have to drill the difficult sour stuff just to meet baseline global demand. So the global price per barrel has to remain high enough to make drilling the difficult, expensive sour crude financially profitable. Otherwise, they'd stop drilling it and we'd have a massive shortage.
Okay, so the price is artificially high to help the sour crude companies break even and make a little profit.
Right. But think about what that means for the companies sitting on the easy sweet crude in places like Nigeria.
Yeah.
They get to sell their oil at that same high global price set by the difficult sour crude, but their actual extraction and refining costs are incredibly low.
So the profit margin is just massive.
It is astronomically huge.
Yeah.
That massive difference between their low cost and the high global price, that is pure economic rent. The sweet crude companies aren't working harder. They aren't smarter or more innovative. They just happen to own a vastly superior natural asset.
It's Ricardo's fertile land near the river all over again, just liquid.
Exactly the same mechanism.
And Collins links this idea of scarcity to the pandemic too, right? With the concept of quasi-rent.
Mm-hmm.
I remember early in COVID paying like $50 for a tiny box of paper face masks that used to cost maybe $5.
Yes, that is a textbook example of quasi-rent. It's short-term, temporary scarcity. Suddenly, overnight, everyone on Earth desperately needs N95 masks and hand sanitizer.
And the supply chain just couldn't handle it.
Right. Supply is fixed in the short term. You can't build a new mask factory in a week, so prices absolutely skyrocket.
And the companies that already had masks sitting in a warehouse made a killing.
Yes, that sudden, massive extra profit is quasi-rent. But economists call it quasi, meaning almost or temporary, because eventually capitalism responds.
Right. Factories retooled. New companies started making masks.
Exactly. Supply eventually catches up with demand, the scarcity ends, prices crash back to normal, and the quasi-rent completely disappears.
Okay, so that rent disappears. Unless you can figure out a way to keep the scarcity going artificially.
Now you're thinking like a monopolist.
Which brings us to Lance Armstrong in the book. This is technically a story about sports and cheating, but Collins frames it purely as a story about economic rent, which I found fascinating.
It is a brilliant way to analyze monopoly rent. Think about it from a purely economic standpoint. What was Lance Armstrong actually selling to the public and his sponsors?
I don't know, bikes, inspiration, the yellow wristbands.
He was selling the absolute certainty of winning. He was selling this incredible, mythic story of the cancer survivor who miraculously conquers the grueling Tour de France year after year.
Right, he dominated the sport entirely.
He essentially held a total monopoly on winning the biggest cycling race in the world, and because he kept winning, he could charge absolutely massive rents in the form of corporate endorsements. Nike, Trek bicycles, Oakley sunglasses.
He was making millions.
Tens of millions. He was earning way, way above his normal opportunity cost as a professional cyclist. He was extracting those rents purely because he was the only human being on Earth delivering that specific, scarce victory.
But the monopoly was completely fake.
It was a total lie. It was built on blood doping and intimidation. He artificially created a scarcity of winning by cheating. He used illegal medical procedures to build a massive barrier to entry that no clean cyclist could ever hope to cross.
Wow.
And look what happened when the monopoly finally broke.
Right, when the lie was finally revealed to the public.
The rent evaporated instantaneously.
He lost something like $75 million in sponsorships almost overnight, didn't he?
He did, because the artificial scarcity was gone.
That is such a powerful image. Rent evaporates the second the monopoly is broken, and true competition can finally enter the market.
It connects perfectly to the modern global economy, because now we have to transition to the latter half of the book, where Collins looks at heterodox economic views.
Heterodox meaning?
Views that challenge the traditional mainstream models. We need to look at how these theories of rent apply to the things we use every single day. We need to talk about why entire countries remain in poverty and why your new smartphone is so incredibly expensive.
Okay, this is where the book gets really spicy. We go back to Nigeria. Collins discusses what he calls the Nigeria paradox, drawing heavily on the work of a scholar named Chibuzo Nathan-Woke.
This is a critical section of the text. Theoretically, based on everything we just learned about differential rent and oil, Nigeria should be an incredibly wealthy nation.
Right, they sit on massive reserves of that high-quality sweet crude we talked about. They are the sovereign landlord of the oil.
Exactly. Under classical theory, they should be collecting all that sweet rent and building a utopian society.
But they clearly aren't. Nigeria is still struggling with massive inequality and poverty.
Right.
Why does the theory fail in reality?
Because of what Woke calls world mining rents. He argues that simply owning the land on paper isn't enough in the modern global economy.
Okay.
You need the advanced technology and the massive capital investment to actually get the oil out of the ground and to the global market.
Right.
Nigeria had the physical oil beneath their feet, but historically they didn't have the deep water drills, the specialized petroleum engineers, the massive pipelines, or the global shipping networks.
But do you have all those things?
The massive multinational corporations headquartered in the global north, companies like Shell, Exxon, Chevron. So these foreign companies come in to a developing nation and they basically say, sure, you sovereignly own the oil, but it is worth exactly $0 if it stays buried in the ground.
Right, you can't eat oil.
Exactly. So the corporations say, if you want us to use our proprietary technology to get it out and sell it, we are going to dictate the terms and we are going to take the lion's share of the profit.
So the multinational corporations essentially have all the actual leverage, despite not owning the land.
Exactly. They use their monopoly on technology and capital to capture the rent. They siphon the wealth away from the developing country that actually owns the natural resource.
It's the resource curse.
Right. The wealth is physically extracted by foreign capital, leaving the supposed owner of the land with just environmental pollution and a tiny fraction of the revenue.
It is Marxist swindle all over again. It just scaled up to a global geopolitical level.
It really is.
And it isn't just about fossil fuels and mining. It's about the tech in our pockets. The book talks about technoscience rent, which is something I honestly think about every time I see a headline about a massive patent lawsuit between tech giants.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the massive legal battles between Apple and Samsung over the last decade, the so-called smartphone wars.
Right.
They weren't fighting in court over who had the most efficient physical factory in China. They were fighting viciously over patents.
Like the slide to unlock feature. I remember that vividly. Apple claimed they literally legally owned the physical gesture of sliding your finger across a piece of glass.
Yes. Now ask yourself, is sliding your finger a physical piece of land?
Obviously not.
No. But a patent legally turns it into land.
How so?
A patent acts as a legal fence built around an abstract idea. It encloses human knowledge the same way a feudal lord enclosed a forest.
Okay, so when Apple sues Samsung for using a similar gesture, they're basically acting like a landlord serving an eviction notice on an idea.
Precisely. This creates a legal monopoly. It allows tech companies to charge a massive premium price, a rent, for their products, and not because the physical phone costs that much to manufacture.
Right. I think I read somewhere that a $1,000 iPhone might only cost like $200 in actual parts and labor to make.
Exactly. So where does that other $800 go?
That's the question.
A huge chunk of that margin is pure technoscience rent.
Wow.
When you buy that phone, you are paying for the brand prestige, the massive portfolio of patents, the locked-in software ecosystem. You are essentially paying rent to the tech giant for the privilege of existing inside their legally enclosed digital garden.
So when I drop $1,000 on a new phone, I'm basically just paying a digital landlord.
In a very real economic sense, yes, you are paying for the legal fence they build around the technology. It's a massive transfer of wealth from consumers to shareholders based purely on their legal right to exclude competitors.
It's depressing how pervasive it is. And this concept bleeds into literally everything we consume. Collins mentions this idea of systems of provision.
Yes, this is a crucial framework for seeing the whole picture.
The London gastropub example he used in the book was brilliant because it genuinely made me hungry and deeply angry at the exact same time.
It's a perfect illustration of how deep the rent rabbit hole goes. Okay, so you walk into a trendy, upscale gastropub in Soho, London. You sit down and you order a plate of corn fritters with avocado salsa.
It sounds delicious,
It does, and it costs you 18 pounds.
which is a pretty standard, painful London price for an appetizer.
Right. Now, as a consumer, you think you are paying for the chef's culinary skill, the waiter's attentive service, and the cool lighting and atmosphere. You think you're paying for the actual service of hospitality.
I mean, yeah, I'm paying for the vibe.
You are definitely paying for the vibe. But if an economist breaks down where that 18 pounds actually goes, a massive chunk of it goes straight to the commercial landlord who owns the brick-and-mortar building in Soho.
Okay, so that's traditional commercial rent.
Right. But then look at the physical ingredients, the corn in those fritters. That corn came from a massive industrial farmer in Nebraska. That American farmer likely paid rent to an agricultural landlord for the right to farm that land.
Okay, so there are layers of rent.
It goes even deeper. That farmer had to buy the corn seeds. He didn't just find them in nature. He bought genetically modified seeds from a massive biotech corporation like Monsanto or Bayer.
Right.
He had to pay a recurring licensing fee for the patented genetic technology hidden inside the seed itself.
And that is technoscience rent again.
Exactly.
Wow. So my pleasant dinner in London is really just invisible layers of rent stacked on top of each other, like a giant lasagna of global exploitation.
That is exactly what systems of provision means. Rent actually structures the entire global food chain from seed to plate. It determines what gets grown, where it gets shipped, where it gets sold, and ultimately, how much it costs you. Rent isn't just an annoying add-on fee. It is the very skeleton of the price tag.
That is just, it's a lot to take in.
It changes how you see every transaction.
It really does. So what does this all mean for us today? We've defined rent. We've traced its violent history from the mud of the Middle Ages. We've seen all the different types and how it hides in our phones and our food.
Right.
But Collins argues toward the end of the book that rent is actually the key to understanding three massive existential crises we are facing right now as a society.
Yes, this is section 6 of our outline today, the so what section.
Right.
Why should the listener care about this abstract theory?
Because rent is fundamentally destroying the world we live in.
It is certainly driving it toward a breaking point.
Let's start with the first crisis, inequality. We
Yeah.
hear about the 1% versus the 99% all the time.
Ever since Occupy Wall Street.
Exactly. But how does this specific concept of rent explain that wealth gap?
Collins uses a specific term here, rentier capitalism.
Rentier capitalism.
Yes, and the ultimate poster child for this system is someone like Jeff Bezos
Hmm.
or Elon Musk. Pick your ultra-billionaire.
Okay, let's unpack Bezos, because I
Mhm.
think a lot of people defend him. They say, look, he built Amazon from a garage. He works incredibly hard. He created thousands of jobs. He deserves every penny.
Okay, let's look at his money. Bezos draws a formal salary from Amazon. That salary is a wage. Let's say he pays himself roughly $80,000 a year in base salary.
Okay.
That $80,000 is compensation for his actual daily labor as an executive. But his immense wealth, the $180 billion, that does not come from his salary. You cannot save up $180 billion from an $80,000 salary.
Obviously not.
His wealth comes from asset appreciation. It comes from owning Amazon stock.
Which is a form of property.
Exactly. And this brings in the famous Thomas Piketty formula that Collins discusses.
R is greater than G.
Yes, RG. It's probably the most important economic equation of the 21st century. R stands for the return on assets. That means rent, stock dividends, capital gains, real estate appreciation.
Okay, the money you make from owning things.
Right. And G stands for the growth of the actual economy, which translates to the growth of normal wages and physical production.
The money you make from working.
Exactly. Piketty looked at centuries of tax data and showed that historically, under capitalism, R is almost always significantly greater than G.
Meaning that purely mathematically, it pays much more to own things than it does to actually do things.
Exactly. If you work for a living, your wages grow very slowly over your lifetime, if they outpace inflation at all.
Usually they don't.
But if you own massive amounts of capital, your wealth grows exponentially fast. Over time, the owners inevitably pull further and further away from the workers. It creates a permanent, entrenched class of rentiers who act like economic black holes, just passively sucking up all the growth of society.
It's rigged. And Collins says this leads to what economists call the quiet life.
The quiet life.
Yeah.
This is the real danger of extreme inequality. When corporations get big enough, they simply stop innovating.
Why would they?
Right. Why would a massive tech monopoly risk billions of dollars in research and development trying to invent a risky new clean energy source when they can just buy a few patents, hire lobbyists to get a government tax break, or just buy up any small competitor that threatens their monopoly?
You stop making new things, and you just start extracting fees from the things you already control.
You sweat the assets.
You sweat the assets. And that lack of innovation leads directly to the second massive crisis Collins outlines, ecology, specifically climate change.
This is a vital connection.
I have to admit, I was struggling with this one when I read the book. I usually just think of corporate pollution as, well, just pollution. Bad behavior. I didn't see the connection to rent.
You have to think about the Earth's atmosphere as a scarce, finite resource.
Okay.
Think of the atmosphere as a giant bucket. It has a strict physical limit. It can only absorb so much carbon dioxide before the global climate systems completely collapse.
Right. That limit is what we call net zero.
Exactly. So the atmosphere is an incredibly valuable, incredibly scarce physical asset. When a massive fossil fuel company emits megatons of carbon into the air, they are using up precious space in that atmospheric bucket.
Okay.
But under our current system, they generally don't pay anything to use that space. They are effectively using a scarce essential asset completely for free.
Wow.
Collins argues they are basically stealing ecological rent.
Stealing ecological rent. So their pollution is essentially unpaid rent to the planet.
Unpaid rent that they are offloading onto the planet and ultimately onto us and future generations who have to deal with the floods and fires.
It's theft from the future to pad today's profit margins.
Exactly. The book brings up the hoteling rule here.
What is that?
It's an economic rule regarding exhaustible resources. It asks a simple question. Should a mining company dig up their coal today and sell it, or leave it in the ground and sell it 20 years from now when it might be more valuable?
Okay.
Rent theory, applying hoteling, suggests we are currently massively underpricing the true rent of the atmosphere. We are treating a scarce, fragile resource as if it were an infinite free dumping ground.
Because if those oil companies actually had to pay the true, mathematically calculated rent for the atmospheric space they are occupying.
Fossil fuels would become completely unaffordable overnight. The entire business model relies on not paying that ecological rent.
That is terrifying.
It is.
Which leads us to the final third crisis Collins identifies. Economic dynamism, or rather, the complete lack of it. Stagnation. The feeling that the global economy is just stuck.
Yes.
Like, we have incredible supercomputers in our pockets, but average wages haven't really meaningfully moved in 40 years.
This connects right back to the idea of the quiet life we discussed. A rentier economy is, by definition, a stagnant economy. If the smartest, most highly educated minds of the world are dedicating their careers to figuring out how to extract tiny micro fees from existing assets, rather than inventing new solutions to human problems, overall growth just grinds to a halt.
We get better at financial engineering, not actual engineering.
Precisely. And Collins points to a very specific historical moment that locked this in globally. The Volcker shock.
Ah, 1979.
Yes. Paul Volcker was the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Inflation was running incredibly high in the late 70s. To fight it, Volcker aggressively spiked interest rates to unprecedented levels.
What did spiking interest rates actually do to the global economy?
It made borrowing money incredibly expensive. And in doing so, it overnight turned massive U.S. and European banks into global rentiers.
How so?
Think about developing countries in the global south. Throughout the 70s, they had borrowed massive amounts of money from Western banks to try and build infrastructure and modernize. When Volcker spiked the interest rates, the payments on all those international loans absolutely exploded.
Oh, no.
Suddenly, these developing nations saw their interest payments double or triple. So instead of spending their national budget on building new schools, hospitals, or roads,
They had to send all their capital straight to banks in New York and London just to avoid defaulting.
exactly. Massive rivers of money flowed from the poorest nations in the South directly to the richest financial institutions in the North. It was pure rent extraction based purely on debt.
It siphoned away all the capital they desperately needed for real development.
It totally crippled those economies for decades. It triggered the third world debt crisis. And frankly, the global economy is still living with the massive structural hangover of that wealth transfer today.
So if we pull all of this together, we are living in a world where wealth inequality is absolutely rampant, the planet's atmosphere is burning up, and the real economy is fundamentally stagnating. All because the deep machinery of our system is perfectly designed to reward passive ownership over actual productive creation.
That is the grim but highly accurate conclusion that Collins leads us to. Rent is the ghost in the machine of modern capitalism.
It really is.
It explains why buying a house feels impossible. It explains why a handful of billionaires are exploding in wealth while average wages remain totally flat. And it explains why meaningful climate action is so incredibly difficult to achieve.
Because someone, somewhere, is quietly collecting a massive rent check on the status quo.
Exactly. Changing the system threatens their rent.
Wow. This has been, it's been intense, but it feels deeply necessary to understand. I genuinely feel like I can see the matrix now. I'm going to look at my apartment lease, my cell phone, my bank account in a completely different light.
That is exactly the goal of analyzing a text like this. The mission of our podcast today was to help you see the global economy not as some fair, natural, free market of absolute equals, but as a heavily constructed landscape of property rights, legal fences, and power dynamics.
So, listener, here is the practical lesson for you today. I challenged you at the start of the episode, and I'm challenging you again. Look at your own monthly expenses. Look at your income.
Take a hard look.
How much of what you pay out every month is for actual created value? The chef cooking your meal, the engineer building your phone, and how much is just rent? How much is just paying the cost of someone else's legal permission?
And conversely, you have to look at your own income. Are you relying entirely on your own daily labor to survive?
Because in a rentier economy, that is a highly precarious place to be.
It is. Understanding this fundamental distinction between productive wages and extracted rent is the absolute first step to successfully navigating this system. You have to ask yourself, how can I stop being just a tenant in my own financial life?
Absolutely. It's about changing your perspective. And listen, friends, we have covered a massive amount of ground today, but we have honestly only scratched the surface of what is actually in this text.
We really have. There are detailed charts, there are deeper historical dives, there are so many nuances about taxation and policy that we just didn't have the time to cover.
Right. So if you want to truly understand the mechanics of this system, if you want to see Marx's swindle and high resolution for yourself, you need to buy this book, Rent, What is Political Economy, by Joe Collins.
I highly recommend it. It is a dense, incredibly powerful tool for your intellectual toolkit. It's not just an academic book, it is a practical manual for understanding exactly why the world looks the way it does right now.
Don't just take our summary for it. Read the primary source. Let the ideas enhance your life.
And engage with the material.
Yes, go find Joe Collins on social media. Engage with him. Ask him the hard questions we didn't get to. Ask him about the specific housing rent crisis in your city.
Authors love hearing how their theories apply to your real life.
They do. And make sure you tell him that the Playing Books podcast sent you his way.
We desperately need more people actively asking these structural questions. We need to move beyond just mindlessly paying the monthly bill and start fundamentally questioning why the bill even exists in the first place.
We really do. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Playing Books podcast. Please take a second right now to follow the show, subscribe on your favorite app, and share this episode with absolutely anyone who pays rent, which, let's be honest, is practically all of you.
Everyone is paying rent somewhere.
Keep reading, keep questioning, and keep playing. We'll see you next time.